The heat in the town of Elmsworth that afternoon was almost unbearable, the kind that stuck to your skin and tasted like dust in your mouth. The sun hung high and cruel over the town square, where the air rippled like water over the scorched wooden planks. It was a day people wouldn't forget, though they didn't yet know it. The courthouse bells struck noon, and with that clang came the start of something ugly. Men and women, some curious, some cruel, and some simply bored, gathered in front of the makeshift auction block where broken wagons and bent tools had once been sold, but today wasn't about property or livestock. Today, it was people. Desperate folks who had fallen into debt, vagrants rounded up under new town laws, and those the sheriff saw as burdens to society. Among them stood one figure who made even the boldest in the crowd exchange uneasy glances. Clarabelle Knox. Clarabelle had once been the belle of Elmsworth, wife to Colonel James Knox, a Confederate veteran and loud proponent of the old order. She had walked the streets in high silk collars, eyes raised to no one, speaking only when it served her image. She was known for her cold beauty, but more for the venom she spat at anyone who didn't meet her standards, especially people of color. More than once, she'd publicly shamed business owners who served black customers. Children of black families remembered how she'd yanked goods out of their hands, or whispered poison into shopkeepers' ears, after her husband died in a gambling dispute and her inheritance dissolved into whiskey and court fees. Clarabelle had nothing left but bitterness, and even that had curdled. So there she stood, wrists bound in front of her, her face still lifted with arrogance despite the filth in her hair and the bruises on her pride. The crowd was hungry for spectacle. Some chuckled, others whispered, and a few sneered at the irony of it all. Women who once drank tea with Clarabelle now snickered from behind parasols, delighted by the fall of their former queen. But no one, not one person, expected what came next. At the edge of the crowd stood Ezra Boone. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of his expression, but everyone knew who he was. Ezra had ridden into town nearly 5 years back, broke and quiet, with a rifle on his shoulder and a mule that looked near death. Over the years, he had built his own ranch from scratch, 5 miles west of town, where the prairie met the river. Some said he was ex-military, others claimed he was a preacher's son who gave up saving souls to save horses. Whatever the truth was, Ezra kept to himself. He spoke only when spoken to, but when he did, even the saloon's roughest cowhand fell silent. He didn't move as the auctioneer rattled off names and debts, didn't flinch when the hammer dropped on an old man with a bad leg. But when Clarabelle's name was called, something in the crowd shifted. There were chuckles, cruel and expectant. The auctioneer, sensing the theater of the moment, played it up. One fine southern lady, fallen on hard times, strong lungs, sharp tongue, who'll take her off our hands. No one spoke. Even the cruelest of men seemed to hesitate. Owning livestock was one thing, but owning a woman like Clarabelle, that was a different kind of trouble. The silence hung awkwardly in the air. Then a voice came, not loud, not dramatic, but firm. $2. Every head turned. Ezra had raised his hand. His eyes were fixed on Clarabelle, unreadable. Some folks laughed, thinking it a joke. Others whispered in alarm. Clarabelle's face twisted into rage. "Do you think you can buy me, you black bastard?" she hissed, her voice like shattered glass. Ezra didn't respond. The auctioneer, caught off guard, looked around. Any higher bids? Going once, going twice, the hammer fell. Sold to Mr. Ezra Boone. Silence, real silence. Not the kind born from boredom or heat, but the kind that comes when something has shifted in the bones of a place. Ezra stepped forward, untied her wrists, and handed her a canteen of water. She slapped it away, cursing him with every vile word she knew. Still, he said nothing. He simply led her to his horse, mounted up, and guided the reins as she walked beside him. No rope, no threat, just quiet and heat and the sound of hooves. Leaving town behind, and every person standing in Elmsworth's dusty square was left with the same question, burning in their minds: what in God's name was Ezra Boone going to do with that woman? The moment Ezra Boone disappeared from sight with Clarabelle Knox walking beside his horse, Elmsworth fell into a stunned quiet, the kind of hush that follows a funeral or a gunshot. Folks stood around awkwardly, staring down the road he'd taken, some shading their eyes against the sun, others whispering with dry mouths and flushed faces. It wasn't that Ezra had done something illegal. No, he'd followed the town's own rules. Clarabelle had been auctioned off as a debtor with no property, and the law allowed a citizen to sponsor such a person into work service. But this wasn't just any sponsorship. This was Ezra Boone, a black man walking off with Clarabelle Knox, the most openly racist white woman the town had known. At the corner of the saloon porch, old Sheriff Daltrey tugged nervously at his mustache. "Ain't my business," he muttered, though his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. Mrs. Petty, the postmaster's wife, shook her head in exaggerated dismay. "Lord help us all," she said loudly, but her voice had the strained joy of someone who lived for scandal. Young boys mimicked Clarabelle's outrage, throwing up their hands and shouting nonsense. Several men chuckled and slapped their knees, calling it justice at last, and a sight to see. But beneath the laughter, there was something else growing, an uneasy discomfort that didn't sit right in the belly. Ezra Boone had done something no one dared imagine. He'd broken the invisible line that kept the town in order. Clarabelle's humiliation was complete. She'd screamed the whole way down Main Street, loud enough for every ear to catch. Her insults had burned the air, old slurs, wild accusations, prophecies of damnation. She called Ezra a beast, a devil, a curse on God's land, and yet, not once had he looked back. He didn't tighten the reins, didn't shove her forward, didn't respond with so much as a glare. He just kept leading the horse at a steady pace, like he was carrying firewood home. Nothing more, nothing less. That silence unnerved people more than her shrieking. It was too calm to deliberate. At the general store, a group of women huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. "What do you suppose he'll do with her?" asked one. "Make her pick rocks, sleep in the barn. Or worse," another whispered, with wide eyes. A man leaning against a barrel snorted. "He should, after all the filth she's thrown his way. If he puts her in a pigsty, I'll call it justice." But it wasn't just the gossip that troubled people. It was what this act meant. Ezra Boone, a man who'd never caused trouble, who minded his business, had never raised his voice. He had turned the entire social order on its head with a single bid and a quiet stare. There had been no vengeance in his eyes, no joy, just purpose. And that was far more terrifying than rage. A few of the older men, the ones who remembered the war and liked to talk big about the old days, felt something clench in their chests. If a black man could buy a white woman at auction and walk away without so much as a challenge, what else was possible? They called it unnatural, unchristian. But deep down, they weren't scared for Clarabelle. They were scared of Ezra, or what Ezra represented, quiet dignity that refused to play the role they'd written for him. That evening, the town buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest. The saloon was full. Glasses clinked louder than usual. The piano player hammered the keys to keep the talk from turning sour. But even in drink and noise, no one could escape the image. Clarabelle Knox, dirty and hateful, walking beside a black cowboy like she was nobody special, out at the edge of town. Ezra's ranch sat quiet under the gathering dusk. No smoke rose from the chimney yet, no dogs barked. But somewhere inside, the story had begun to shift. Not just for Ezra, not just for Clarabelle, but for Elmsworth, a town that had clung so tightly to its pride, it never thought to question where it led them. And in that silence, everyone in town, even those who would never admit it, began to wonder, what kind of man chooses mercy over revenge? Ezra Boone brought Clarabelle Knox to his ranch, just as the last rays of the sun were bleeding out behind the hills. The sky burned orange and violet, and a wind had begun to pick up across the wide prairie grass, whispering like voices too tired to shout. Clarabelle's boots dragged in the dirt, her pride bruised raw by every step. She hadn't spoken in nearly an hour, not since her last insult bounced off Ezra's silence like a stone thrown at a mountain. She was used to resistance, she thrived on it, but this unwavering calm felt like drowning in still water. No one came to greet them, no servants, no ranch hands, not even a dog. Just the two of them, dust-covered and stretched thin. By the heat of the day, the ranch house was small but solid. The kind of place built with calloused hands and quiet determination. It stood at the edge of a fenced corral and a small vegetable patch. Nothing grand, but everything purposeful. Ezra didn't speak as he helped her down from the horse. She didn't thank him. She'd sooner chew glass. He opened the door, held it without a word, and she stepped inside like a woman entering a tomb. To her surprise, the house was clean. Not fancy, no rugs or chandeliers, but there was order. A shelf with books, a rifle over the hearth, a wooden table with 2 chairs, both polished smooth by years of use. Ezra led her to a small room near the back, clearly a guest space, though it didn't look like it had been used in some time. The bed had a handmade quilt folded with care. A tin basin rested on a side table half filled with clean water. A plain cotton dress, washed and mended, hung on a peg by the door. Clarabelle stood stiffly, eyes narrowed. "What is this? You planning to civilize me?" she sneered, still clutching what was left of her pride. Ezra didn't answer. He walked to the table, set down a bowl of stew and a crust of cornbread on a plate, then walked out. The only sound left in the room was the creaking of floorboards under her tired feet and the soft clink of the spoon against the bowl. She stared at the food like it was poison, arms crossed, jaw tight. She would not be tamed. Not by him, not by anyone. For 2 days, she refused to eat. She sat on the bed with her arms wrapped around her knees, eyes darting to the door whenever Ezra came to replace the untouched tray. He didn't scold her. He didn't mock her. He just left a fresh bowl each morning and another each night. On the 3rd night, when her stomach cramped so tight she nearly passed out, she reached for the stew in the dark. Her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon. It smelled of beans, beef, and something faintly sweet, maybe a bit of molasses. The taste was rich and strange, warmer than anything she'd had in years. She finished it in silence, cheeks flushed. Not with shame, but something harder to name. The next morning, she awoke to the sound of hammering. From the window, she watched Ezra repairing the barn roof, moving with the rhythm of a man who didn't just work, he belonged to the land. There was no spectacle to him, no desire for attention. He splitwood like a man mending a broken promise, steady and focused, every motion a sermon in patience. She hated how calm he looked. She hated how he made her feel, unsure, like maybe he wasn't the monster she wanted him to be. When he returned to the house that evening, sweat soaking his shirt, he brought in another bowl of stew. She didn't thank him, but she ate. This time in front of him, slowly, quietly. He nodded once, took a seat across from her, and began repairing a leather strap without saying a word. For nearly an hour, they sat like that, two people with 1,000 ghosts between them, and not a single word to bridge the gap. That night, Clarabelle lay awake, staring at the rafters, her hands folded over her chest. Her hatred had no fuel. In this place, Ezra wasn't fighting her. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't trying to change her. He was simply being, and that, somehow, was worse, because every hateful thing she'd ever said or believed was starting to feel like it had nowhere to rest in the silence he carried. And for the first time in her life, Clarabelle Knox, daughter of the Old South, widow of a Confederate, began to feel the weight of her own words. By the end of the first week, Clarabelle Knox found herself doing chores without being told. Not because she wanted to, but because idleness had begun to feel like a punishment worse than labor. Ezra never gave orders. He never pointed, never barked commands. He simply moved, fixing a fence, hauling water, cleaning saddles, and left the tools where anyone with sense could find them. He expected nothing from her, but his quiet, disciplined rhythm left little room for excuses. The silence of his wrench was a mirror, and in it, Clarabelle saw not just the dirt on her hands, but the bitterness she carried like rusted chains. At first, she did small things, just to busy her hands. She swept the porch. She folded the laundry he left drying on the line. She patched a tear in one of his shirts, though she muttered curses under her breath with every stitch. She'd grown up with servants, always told her hands were too delicate for work. Yet somehow, the ache in her palms gave her a strange comfort she didn't understand. The blisters hurt less than the shame she couldn't name. Ezra noticed, of course, but said nothing. That was his way. He watched without judging, without praising. One morning, after she finished feeding the chickens, she found a clean apron folded neatly on her bed. No note, no instructions. Just an offering, as if to say, if you want to keep going, here's something to help you. She didn't thank him, but she wore it. Clarabelle tried to test him in those early days. She made snide remarks, small jabs, about his place, about how the world had lost its order. Ezra never rose to it, never snapped. Sometimes, he'd give her a long, calm look, the kind that stripped away everything and left her exposed. She began to dread those stares more than she'd feared whippings as a child. They were not angry. They were not proud. They were disappointed, and that, somehow, stung deeper. On the 7th day, Ezra came in with a cut on his forearm from barbed wire. Without a word, he washed the blood, poured whiskey on the wound, and sat at the table. Clarabelle hovered nearby. She didn't know why she hesitated, but something compelled her to fetch the clean cloth from the shelf. She knelt down beside him and began to wrap the wound. Her hands shook. She didn't look at him. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "No, I don't," she snapped, but her voice lacked the venom it once held. She tied the cloth tighter than she needed to, more out of nerves than spite. "You've got a steady hand," he said. She blinked. Praise. It sounded foreign, especially from him. "You mocking me?" "No," and that was that. He got up, poured water into 2 tin cups, and slid one across the table, toward her. She didn't drink it, but she didn't leave either. In the days that followed, their rhythm became unspoken. Ezra would do the heavy labor, and Clarabelle, grudgingly, filled the spaces in between. She began to cook again, not the delicate, cream-covered meals of her past life, but the simple food that filled a rancher's belly. Cornbread, beans, salted meat, boiled greens. She scrubbed the floors, tended the garden, mended clothes. And while she would never admit it aloud, a strange calm began to grow in her chest. But at night, when the chores were done and the sky turned ink black over the prairie, lay awake and questioned everything. Why hadn't he taken revenge? Why didn't he use her the way she had feared? She had insulted him, humiliated his kind for years. She had spat on men like him, cursed them, looked down her nose as if her blood was more pure. And here he was showing her more dignity than she'd ever shown herself. She would stare at the ceiling and wonder what it meant. What kind of man could endure hate and respond with discipline? What kind of man could turn silence into strength? It gnawed at her pride, tore at the foundations of everything she'd believed. But somewhere in that quiet, under the stars beyond the open window, something inside her began to shift, not out of guilt, not yet, but out of confusion. She had always been certain of her world. Now, she wasn't even sure of her own reflection. And Ezra Boone, steady, unyielding, patient, was doing the unthinkable, changing her, not with force or fire, but with the quiet mercy of his presence. Clarabelle stood one morning at the edge of the garden, her hands stained with soil, staring off into the breeze that carried the faint scent of sage and distant smoke. It was early still, and the dew clung to the leaves like tiny promises, not yet broken. Ezra was out riding the western fence line, checking the posts before the summer storms rolled in, alone, with nothing but the quiet creak of the windmill and the calls of crows circling above. Clarabelle found herself listening, not to sounds, but to something inside her she'd silenced for years. Memories stirred like dust caught in sunlight. Her father's voice, hard, cold, full of thunder, echoed in her bones. Never trust a Negro. They're born liars. Her mother's silence had been worse. A woman who stood tall at church and whispered venom behind gloved hands. Clarabelle had grown up steeped in that world, taught not to question, only to repeat. She had worn her hate like a family heirloom, polished, protected, passed down. And now, she found herself among fields and fences, washing dishes in a black man's kitchen. And she could no longer tell whether her ancestors would weep or roar with fury. She didn't know when it began, but she had started to watch Ezra, not with suspicion anymore, but with something bordering on curiosity. He moved differently than any man she'd known. He didn't waste energy. He didn't shout or curse. He didn't need to prove himself. He let his work speak for him, and it spoke loud. The ranch was orderly because he was orderly. The animals responded to him like they understood his calm. Even the horses, usually quick to spook, lowered their heads when he passed. Clarabelle had never believed dignity could exist without wealth. Ezra shattered that lie with every nail he drove and every quiet word he spoke. One evening, after supper, she found a copy of Frederick Douglass's autobiography on his shelf. She'd never read it. In fact, she'd once burned a pamphlet that quoted Douglass when it showed up at her church. But something about the book called to her. She took it to her room and opened the first page with trembling fingers. That night, she read until her eyes burned. The words, bold, unapologetic, sharp as broken glass, cut through the fog in her mind. She realized, with a jolt, that Ezra didn't just carry dignity. He carried generations of survival. He carried pain that her family had helped cause. Clarabelle tried to sleep after that, but it was like lying beneath a storm that never broke. She kept thinking of the man who once called her Miss Knox with a hat in hand, only to be beaten by her husband for daring to smile. She remembered how she had laughed, not because it was funny, but because it made her feel superior. The thought made her stomach twist now. In Ezra's home, surrounded by his kindness and discipline, she began to choke on the weight of her own past. The next morning, she stepped outside and found Ezra on the porch, repairing a boot. She hesitated, holding the book in both hands like an offering. "I read it," she said. Ezra looked up, his expression unreadable. "And she faltered. "I didn't know people lived through things like that. Not really. Not like that." He nodded once, then went back to stitching. "Most don't want to know." Clarabelle sat beside him on the steps, not touching, not speaking further, just being. It was the first time she'd chosen to sit next to him. The prairie stretched before them like a wound and a promise. And for the first time, the silence between them didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a door slowly creaking open. Ezra didn't need to say a word. He knew the book had done what no sermon or punishment could. It had forced her to face herself. Not the version the town admired, but the woman behind the pride. The woman who had never questioned where her hate came from until now. And as the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land, Clarabelle Knox, once the most venomous tongue in Elmsworth, felt something dangerous stirring in her chest. Remorse. The town of Elmsworth wasn't big, but it had a mouth large enough to swallow reputations whole. The word of Clarabelle Knox's whereabouts began to ripple through the saloons and church pews like wildfire caught on dry grass. For days, no one had seen her, not a single sweeping glance of her scowl at the general store, not one whispered insult from her porch. And then came the whispers. She was on Ezra Boone's ranch, living under the same roof. With him, the man she once called a stain on good soil, the one she refused to walk past without covering her nose with a handkerchief. That man. At first, the rumors were laughed off as too wild to believe. Clarabelle Knox. Under a black man's roof. She'd rather hang herself with her own corset string. But then the Reverend's daughter claimed she'd seen her, from a distance, wearing plain cotton and carrying a sack of feed. And she smiled. That sealed it. The town turned mean in its confusion. Men at the bar spat into the dirt. Women with bonnets whispered behind hymnals. Children were told to look away when Ezra rode into town for supplies, though he held his head no higher and no lower than before. Ezra had never been welcomed with warmth in Elmsworth, tolerated, perhaps because of his skill with horses, his sharp eye for fence work, his ability to do what others could not, but respect. That was a bridge too far for many. And now that he had the Queen of Southern Fire hoeing vegetables beside him, the town could barely breathe through its own outrage. Clarabelle sensed it, too. She'd always been attuned to social heat, the shift in glances, the brittle smiles, the pregnant silences. But now she wasn't the one wielding it. She was the target. The first time she returned to town with Ezra at her side, both riding quietly with supplies in tow, the effect was like thunder in a dry canyon. People froze. The blacksmith dropped a hammer. Two old women crossed the street without meeting. Her eyes, a little boy asked aloud, "Mama, is that Miss Knox?" And his mother yanked him away like he'd touched a snake. Clarabelle had expected judgment. She had even prepared for it. But the sharpness of it, the betrayal in the eyes of those who once invited her to teas and prayer circles, was another lesson she hadn't known she needed. Ezra didn't speak. He never did in town. He simply tied the horses, shouldered the sacks of flour and oats, and walked beside her like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. When they entered the general store, silence thickened around them like fog. The shopkeeper, Mr. Willoughby, looked at Clarabelle as if she were a ghost. She met his gaze, chin high. "I'll take 5 pounds of coffee, 2 sacks of flour, and that blue thread by the window," she said, her voice steady. Willoughby hesitated, then moved to fill the order. "You sure you don't want me to put it on your husband's old account?" he said flatly, referring to her late Confederate spouse. She didn't blink. "No, put it on Mr. Boone's." That moment landed like a hammer on the dusty floorboards. Ezra didn't flinch. He simply nodded once and reached for his coin pouch. Clarabelle stood straighter than ever before. She wasn't hiding, not anymore. And if the town couldn't stomach the sight of her walking beside a man she had once hated, a man now showing her more dignity than any churchgoer ever had, then that was their burden to carry, not hers. As they rode back through the town, the sun high and unforgiving, Clarabelle felt the weight of every stare. But this time, it didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like proof. Proof that change, no matter how small, had the power to shake even the most stubborn roots. Back at the ranch, Ezra handed her a cup of water and said only, "You did fine." She looked at him then, truly looked, and for the first time in her life, she smiled, not out of pride, not out of scorn, but from a place so deep and raw, it surprised even her. "Thank you," she whispered. Ezra said nothing. But that night, as they sat on the porch beneath the stars, side by side, the silence between them was no longer the absence of words. It was the presence of something growing, something unthinkable. The storm came not from the sky, but from the hills, riding on horseback, boots thudding against the earth like war drums. 3 men from town. Ezra saw them long before they reached the gate, standing on the porch with one hand resting loosely on the rifle leaning beside him. Clarabelle was inside, kneading bread dough with her sleeves rolled up, humming an old tune she barely remembered from childhood. When she heard the riders, she stepped to the window and felt her stomach drop. They weren't there to visit. She knew that immediately. Ezra didn't move as the men dismounted. Their eyes were full of fire, not righteous, not holy, just the kind that smoldered from fear, dressed up as power. One of them, a thick-chested man named Burl Danton, had been friends with Clarabelle's late husband. He stepped forward like he still owned the dirt beneath his boots. "Ezra," Burl said, to casual. Ezra didn't answer. His silence pressed harder than 1,000 words. "We came to speak to the lady," Burl said, turning his head toward the cabin. "Make sure she ain't here against her will." Ezra's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. "She's not." Another man, lankier and younger, spat into the dirt. "Ain't right," he muttered. "Town's talkin'. Church folk are real uneasy." "You rode out here," Ezra said, calm and cold, "to ask about gossip." Burl's expression soured. "We came to remind her where she comes from, who she is." Clarabelle opened the door just then, wiping her hands on a flour-streaked cloth. Her hair was tied back, her cheeks flushed from the stove. She looked like someone reborn in labor, not lounging in silk or spitting hate from a rocking chair. "Is there a problem?" she asked, stepping beside Ezra. Burl removed his hat. "Not out of respect, out of old habits. Clarabelle, we're worried you've lost your way. You belong to this town, to our people. You can't," he glanced at Ezra with disgust that he didn't bother hiding. "You can't just forget who you are." Clarabelle stared at him for a long, silent moment. Then, with a voice sharper than a branding iron, she said, "You mean I can't forget who you told me I was?" Burl blinked, taken aback. "All my life," she continued, her voice rising only slightly, "you and men like you filled my head with poison, taught me that hate was heritage, that cruelty was strength. But this man," she gestured to Ezra without breaking eye contact, "was beneath me. But not one of you ever showed me the kind of grace he has." The younger rider stepped forward. "You don't belong here, Clarabelle. Not like this." She laughed, bitter and clean, like rain on dust. "I didn't belong when I was in town, either. I was your puppet. Now I'm free, and if that scares you, then maybe it should." Burl's face twisted. "You forget yourself." "No," Clarabelle said firmly. "For the first time, I remember myself." Ezra didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He stood beside her, like the earth stands beside a tree, rooted, unmoved. The third man, older and quieter, finally spoke. "You're not safe out here, not from folks who disagree." Ezra looked at him then. "Just one glance. Let them come." The three men left after that, angry, confused, defeated in ways they didn't understand. As they rode off, Clarabelle felt the shaking in her hands. Ezra reached over and took the cloth from her fingers. "You stood your ground," he said. "Simply, I was terrified," she whispered. "That's how you know it mattered." They sat together on the porch long after the sun dipped behind the hills. No more words passed between them. But something in the air had changed. The storm had come and passed. And still she stood. Clarabelle Knox, once the town's most venomous tongue, had looked the past in the eye and told it she would no longer serve. Seasons shifted, as they always do, on the prairie. The golden grass turned silver in the autumn frost, and the hush of winter crept down from the mountains in slow, heavy sighs. Ezra's ranch endured fences mended, cattle fattened, firewood chopped and stacked in neat cords. Life moved not with grandeur but with steadiness, like water wearing down stone. But what changed within the cabin walls was far greater than anything the land could show. Clarabelle had never known real work before, not like this. Every day, she awoke before the sun, tied back her graying hair, and walked the long hallway that once felt like a prison but now smelled of warm bread and wood. She cooked, cleaned, tended the animals. She stitched clothing and read by lamplight. But more than anything, she listened. To Ezra, to the land, to herself. Ezra spoke little, as always, but when he did, his words landed like nails. Firm, precise, meant to hold things together. He began to tell her stories from his past. Not for sympathy, never for pity. Just truth, laid bare like ribs beneath sun-dried skin. Tales of his mother, born free but sold into bondage by lawless men. Of learning to ride by candlelight because white boys at the stables wouldn't teach him. Of his brother, lynched for smiling at the wrong girl. Clarabelle listened, hands folded, throat tight. She didn't apologize. He never asked her to. But she held his pain with a reverence she never thought herself capable of. One night, after supper, she brought out a letter. Her hand trembled as she held it out. Ezra looked at it, then at her. "It's for my sister," Clarabelle said. "She stopped speaking to me years ago, said I was too bitter to be around her children." She was right. Ezra nodded once. "What does it say?" "It says," she hesitated. "It says, I'm trying." He said nothing more, only returned to whittling the edge of a chair leg he was repairing. But Clarabelle saw the smallest flicker of something in his eyes. Approval, maybe, or understanding. By spring, the town had stopped whispering. Not because it had accepted her, not fully, but because it could no longer deny what it saw. Ezra's ranch thrived. Clarabelle no longer hid. She came to market with her back straight and her voice calm. She taught a black child how to read outside the church while his mother shopped for soap. She handed an old rival a jar of peach preserves with a gentle nod. The people didn't know what to do with her. Some still crossed the street, some still looked away. But others, a few, began to soften. It wasn't just the town that changed. Clarabelle's own reflection startled her sometimes. Not in appearance, though the lines around her eyes had deepened and her shoulders were stronger, but in presence, she no longer flinched at her own thoughts. She didn't lie to herself to feel superior. The mask was gone, and beneath it, there lived a woman she was only beginning to know, and Ezra. He kept doing what he always had, plowing soil, mending leather, speaking with his hands, showing with his actions. He never asked her to stay, but he made it impossible for her to leave. Not with force, with dignity, with respect, with quiet courage that made her want to be better every day. One evening, as they sat beneath a sky bruised purple and gold, Clarabelle turned to him and said, "You bought me." He looked up, calm as ever. "I freed you." She shook her head, gently. "No, Ezra, I think you taught me how to free myself." He said nothing, but he reached for her hand, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. She laced her fingers through his, not as a servant or penitent or penance, but as an equal, as a woman who had been wrong, had been blind, and had finally chosen to see. They sat like that, hand in hand, as the sun disappeared behind the prairie, and the night rose slow and sacred around them. Freedom had taken many forms across that land, but none quite like this.